quick reminder that our meetings are recorded and you can access those to review or if there's a missed meeting. And then also just know that they're public domain. So anybody out in the public can view our recordings, and just wanted you to be aware. So I'm going to move us into community agreements. Thank you. So just want you to take a moment to look over our community agreements that we developed. And just for today, we want us to center on number 3, which is going to be to challenge assumptions. We'll talk more about this as we get into it, but we really want to lean into this one today, specifically because it means that we'll be looking at existing structures, ideas, and things that you know for sure. And we're going to be acknowledging and holding space for some discomfort when maybe we move away from those things or outside of our comfort zone. And then it also means that we're going to be interrupting systems of oppression and internalized oppression that may show up in our conversations. So we're just going to hold that one close today and just look at the other ones, and we're going to move forward.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. And thank you, Sharon, for moving us along. So we're going to connect today around a quote from one of my new favorite authors, Adrienne Maree Brown. And this is a quote that actually comes out of her Facebook message shortly after the mass shooting in Las Vegas in 2017. So this is before 2020. And I think gives us an opportunity to really think about all the things that have happened and how it still resonates for what we are living through right now. So I'll just go ahead and read it because it will be the basis of our connection in breakout rooms today. So we are all living in impossible times. If it were fiction, it would be critiqued as hyperbolic. If it were nightmares, we would never sleep. We're living in times created by our own species. Our visions are ropes through the devastation. Look further ahead like our ancestors did. Look further, extend, hold on, pull, evolve. So with that, really thinking about our shared and collective work with each other in this group and our collective vision for what we are aspiring to for our students and families and educators in Oregon. Want to think about what is that thing that is pulling you or that you're holding on to, or what does that further ahead look like for you that keeps you inspired and hopeful in this shared work that we're embarking on and engaging in together. So with that, we will be in small breakout rooms of 3 just to connect and spend some time with each other.
Vanessa, I see that it's put you and I both in room 3. Oh, did she jump?
Yeah, I wonder if we could move, I'll do it. I'm going to move Todd to room 3 because the rest of us haven't joined room 1 and he's in it.
Perfect.
See if that worked. There we go.
Thank you.
Do I need to move someone? Do I need to move Kristen? Because I think she's unassigned.
Oh, yeah. Maybe in the 3.
Okay.
I'm still here. I'm just going to stay out of a breakout for now. Are you all by yourself, Beth?
Yeah, just hanging out.
Okay. I'm just trying to catch up on a bunch of reading, so I just seem to get a whole bunch of stuff today, and most of it's all due tomorrow, so I'm just trying to get some things done. Sorry.
Oh, that's great. Fit it in when you can.
I just feel guilty. You're just sitting there all by yourself.
No, it's fine. I'll be back in a minute.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right, I think we're all back from breakout rooms now. Yes, okay. Nice to see you all again. I'm Amy Craig, helping to support this lovely group. I use she, her pronouns. Co-founder of Sea Change, and my colleague Pooja Bhatt is here as well to help support y'all today. So if we go to the next slide, our goal, 3 objectives for today. The first one is to hear feedback from the community engagement sessions, which Vanessa sent a link out to the full overview, and we'll get a little bit into that. We'll get clarity, ensure that there's clarity on what the framework is that we're talking about for the SEL recommendations. And we'll take some initial votes to understand where there's consensus and where we need more time together. So at the last meeting, you saw how a lot of the pieces you'd been working on since the start of this work group were getting pulled together in the report. You've had a couple opportunities to see the report and to provide feedback. Vanessa sent out that link to the full feedback document in the email, and I'm putting it in the chat now too, so you can see what feedback was given and how it was incorporated. And today is really about digging into details and getting closer to consensus around the recommendations. So no goal around hitting consensus today, but really trying to elevate where there's agreement and where there's not. And I think with that, we'll turn it over back to you, Vanessa, to get into the engagement session feedback.
Yep, and that's actually Beth, so handing it right back to Beth.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so what we want to do is highlight some of the listening sessions that took place during June. Vanessa and I were talking, it has felt like a whirlwind this month. So on June 7th and 8th, 9th, we were able to dedicate some time to engaging with members from various student success advisories. So the African American, Black, American Indian, Alaskan Native, the Latino, Latina, Latinx advisory groups, as well as the State Advisory Council for Special Education. Then on June 16th, we were able to meet with the English Learners Advisory, and all the different advisories provided fantastic feedback. So they helped answer some of the questions that we provided. Some of the general categories that we were looking at were around the T-cell constructs and CASEL competencies. We looked at the system standards, asked questions around system standards, implementation considerations, the socio-emotional learning and equity pieces, and then anything else that they wanted to share with us. So I will hand it over to Vanessa to go through the next.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm going to put in the chat the actual document that captures all of the themes from these conversations. They were really enlightening. There was a lot that was affirmed and confirming in terms of the trajectory of how we've been thinking about standards, system standards, implementation worries. All of those things were expressed and validated by the group. And so just wanted to name that. You all have access to that document, so we're not going to go through it line by line, but it is worth a look just so you can see it in its entirety and get a sense of how things are resonating. But want to just name a couple that the T-cell constructs especially were connecting to folks. They really resonated with those, and the implication for doing that co-constructive work alongside the adults and the students and families, that really needs to happen in deep partnership with each other. So that was something that I wanted to elevate. As well as we had quite a few folks from SPED world that really see this as the potential for really curving some referrals into special education. If we see this as a tier 1 practice that everyone is responsible for in a school building and helping to cultivate. So they really resonated with that idea. And then just this idea that we're coming back from the pandemic and there's a need to rethink things and look at things differently. And so how do we create those spaces to be affirming and welcoming to all? And so just the timing of this feels really right is what came up. And then want to move us into the next slide, which just names some questions and tensions that folks in these advisory groups named for us. And you'll see that there's a lot of what we've been talking about also. So a lot of them, these questions and tensions are also actually affirming the questions and tensions that we've been grappling with along the way. And so just to note some, one that was really interesting was around agency. If that's something we're going to cultivate authentically, then how does the system respond to that and the implications around, even testing at the state level? So how do we create that sense of autonomy and agency, and how does our system change to really support that vision and view of what this work can look like for schools and districts? And then something that came up was just the importance of ongoing opportunities to examine bias, positionality, power dynamics, and how it shows up in this work. So really being mindful and paying attention to that every step of the way. So from our work on this team all the way through implementation, and then even reflection, right? This is our first attempt. So will we be able to make pivots and make changes to mirror that need? And then this idea of relationship between the T-cell, right, the transformative SEL constructs, and the CASEL competency. So they had some wonderings about that. And that makes sense because we haven't yet really teased that out ourselves. And that's something we want to spend some time in today's meeting exploring. And of course, I'm wearing my smartwatch for the first time and it's telling me things. Okay. And then our final slide, Sharon, if you can move us into the next one, are things that just want to elevate that we'll be returning to a little bit later, but we have made some changes based on the feedback we received that seemed to be in line with the thinking of the group. And you all will get a chance to see if that feels or lands right for you all. So just want to note that there have been some changes to the guiding principles based on that feedback. Any questions? I think we have time for questions.
I really appreciate you getting this feedback. I think when we were talking about like how to include community voice, this was really like what we were, like what I wanted and didn't know how to get there. So thank you so much for doing that.
Thanks, Annie. And, I appreciate you too, because you were really advocating for this. And I also did not know the path forward, but we did. We found a way to really make sense of the connected work that is already happening. And there was just deep appreciation for that collaboration and partnership that I think is going to is the beginning of future partnership together. So I'm really excited for the potential also in the future.
Great. Thanks, Vanessa. If other questions are coming up for you as we keep going, please do feel free to put them in the chat too if they come up for you. So as I mentioned, we first wanted to make sure we're all clear again on what is making up our SEL framework, the recommendations framework in this report. So as you saw last time, and I've hopefully seen in the report a couple times now, these 4 components make up what we're calling the SEL framework, the recommended SEL framework. So the foundation there in green, what really makes up the foundation of everything is the guiding principles. And those are the beliefs and values that we hope are informing all the rest of the pieces, both in this process and that will continue to inform future processes around SEL as a standards work group moves forward after this group as well. So guiding principles as a foundation, and then our 2 big pieces here in blue. First, the student standard fundamentals. So what do we want students to be able to know and do? And we called them fundamentals again at this level because that is what has been asked for of this group, is what are the high level standards? What makes up those standards that we want to put out for students? And again, there will be a future group that goes into more detail on that. So what are the fundamentals around student standards that we want to name at this point? And then the system standards, the other side in blue. What do we want to say about what the system should know or be able to do in order to support students and support everyone in the system as we go along? So again, at that fundamental level, what do we want to name at this point around what the system needs to be doing to support SEL? And then the top piece in gray there, the implementation considerations and opportunities. What are those systemic supports? What are those opportunities, connected opportunities that we want to name here as recommendations to really put a roof on our house and help make sure that this work is protected and can move forward in the best way possible? So knowing that we're not going to be able to name everything under the sun that could support this work, but what are those key opportunities we want to name at this juncture that we think are important to call out and be considered by the state board as we move forward? So that is what makes up the recommended SEL framework. Those are the 4 pieces that we're going to spend today talking about. We're going to take some consensus votes on each of these pieces in an attempt to move forward in consensus as a group on the entire framework. So just pausing there, are there any questions on what this is, what we're working towards together, what we mean by system standards fundamentals, student standard fundamentals? Any questions there? Feel free to jump in verbally, or you can use the chat if you're more comfortable. Okay. Great. Well, again, if questions come up as we go along, please do raise them. So let's move to the next slide. So then, as I said, we're going to spend the bulk of the meeting today really getting into the details of those components of that framework. And really wanting to understand where there's consensus so far and where there's not. Knowing that we don't have everybody today, there might be some perspectives that come in after this meeting. Again, we're not trying to get to consensus today, but want to get an initial check on where there's agreement, where there's not. And want to name that we fully expect there to be places where there's not agreement in today's meeting. I would be shocked if we were all in agreement on all of the pieces and could put a bow on it. So the invitation is to really name if you're feeling like something's out of alignment, if you're feeling like it's not in alignment with the guiding principles, if you're feeling like it's confusing to you, that this is really an opportunity to air those pieces. To name them, we'll have some small group time and some full group time, and you can always use the chat. But that is the invitation, the hope today, that we're really understanding where there isn't agreement so that we can dig into those spots between this meeting and the next one. in this meeting and the next one. Okay, so what this is going to look like is we're going to start with a couple proposed changes to what you saw in the last version of the report that Vanessa is going to walk us through. I'm going to review what a consensus tool looks like. That's a fist to 5 vote, a 0 to 5 vote. We'll review what that looks like, and we'll start taking some consensus votes, again, just to get a sense of where we are and where we need more discussion and conversation together. Great. So go to the next slide before I turn it back over to Vanessa. So again, a fist to 5 consensus making tool. Starting at a fist or a 0 is a block. So that means if you're giving something a 0, you mean I'm not at all comfortable with it. It needs changes for me to be comfortable with it moving forward. A 1 means that you don't support it, but you won't block it. So you might have some reservations and need discussion, but you're not gonna block it, meaning you're not gonna like drop out of the group or something if it were to move forward, that you need discussion on it. A 2, minimally support, means that you're moderately comfortable, you feel okay about it, but you want to discuss some minor issues. So there might be some minor issues that you need to discuss before you can move into a 3 or 4 or 5. But again, you're not in a place of like, this is not okay, I'm blocking this. 3 is not in total agreement, but you feel comfortable with it moving forward without more discussion. So a 3 might be, I have some reservations about this. I have some questions, but they're not essential to it moving forward. A 4 is solid support. So you think it's a good idea, you support it, you're ready for it to move forward. And number 5 is like, I love this, I'm going to champion this. I can speak about this to others and feel really confident in this moving forward. So the way this will work in the group is anything, if we are all at 3s, 4s, or 5s, we will call that consensus. So it means that there might be some minor disagreements or questions still, but if everyone in the group is at a 3, 4, or 5, that would be a consensus decision, and we would decide that is done for the group. And again, today, the expectation is not that we're going to get there, but we're going to start to know where has the most support. Anything else I want to say there? Anything I missed, Vanessa? Not me, Stu.
I don't think so. I think you got it.
Okay, so that's the model we're working with. And when we're doing it in the group today, we're going to use the chat. So you'll put a 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, or 5 in the chat. That's a little bit easier than us trying to see hands and fingers as we walk through. Great. So our first point of process, first topic of process is talking about student standards, and Vanessa has a proposal to share. Again, that's a little different than what you saw in the report. So we'll talk it through and then answer questions and take a consensus vote and work from there.
Thanks, Amy. And Sharon, if you can move us to the next slide, that'd be wonderful. Yeah, so this proposal comes out of conversations that we've been having in the bigger group and then also in the smaller standards work group. And so just want to kind of give that some shape in terms of our conversation. And this also has come out of just what has been affirming in some of the engagement sessions and even in conversations with other SEL TOSAs, climate specialists, those that are doing the work in the field right now, where we are in the world, and this idea of just knowing that there's some initiative fatigue for teachers. And so thinking about how do we want these standards to look potentially different. So we also want to acknowledge that this is a time that we have to make some hard decisions. So just to say that, and that means kind of stretching ourselves, noticing where discomfort comes from, and thinking about what is really best for our students and the future. So with that, these are some essential questions that I think are helpful in terms of guiding the scope of what the state can and should provide, and knowing that there's other buckets of work that live within other pieces. So some of the questions are, what grain size will be most conducive to creating change? So we're thinking about, right, that transformative piece. What is that change going to look like? What will be most well received, right? So thinking about educators in classrooms, students, families, and then what is the work that is occurring at both local and state level? And what is the scope of the standards that is going to be most effective in moving us along? So those are kind of some of the underpinnings that are framing our conversation today in this proposal. So what we are proposing, if you move us to the next slide, is a revisiting or revising of how to approach the student standard fundamentals section of the report, and specifically looking at, can they be framed or created to be something more in line like the Common Core standards for mathematical practices. So this is something that has come up in numerous places and spaces. And so if you look at these, there are 8 of them, and these are K through 12. So they do not change. They are the same across the K through 12 system. And they're intentionally broad enough to create access points and touch points with lessons and learning and through curriculum. And they're really about processes. So these are the kinds of ways that mathematicians would think about when they're solving a problem. So they're just like essential components of doing mathematics that are universal and broad. So on the left-hand side, you see the actual standards, and then on the left-hand side, and then on the right-hand side, they're converted into I can statements for students. So if we can move to the next slide. So just want to share some of the rationale as to why we might look at something like this, how it might look in practice, and what it actually means for our conversation here today. So one of the first pieces is around responding to initiative fatigue. We know that teachers are overwhelmed. This is really an opportunity to simplify and having a few but really big standards. And then we want to really think about this integration, right? Because we want them to be integrated through all content areas throughout the school day. And so what is the easiest way to go about that? K through 12 system. And so this idea that less is more might allow for an easier way of approaching and finding connections with the standards. And the more open and nimble they are, the more manageable they can be. And then really thinking again about grades 6 through 12, right, where you're really in the content, deep in the content. How can you embed those, and so that they're not just discrete student skills, but you can embed them into your content as well. And then what came up in our engagement sessions over and over again is honoring the linguistic and cultural ways of being of diverse students and families. And so it's, when you think about the transformative focal constructs, curiosity, belonging, identity, it becomes really hard to think about what is developmental for each of those, right? And so I think one thing that we're considering here is this value of not moving into sort of like a measurement or assessment or deciding on what is developmentally appropriate, who gets to decide that, right? That's different across cultures. And so it's really this question of, should we even go down the route of looking at these from a developmentally appropriate lens? And so this idea that hopefully that can mitigate harm and bias if they're kind of left to be open and kind of vast in their way of being. And so with that, this value of wholeness and complexity, right? When we start breaking belonging into parts, or we start breaking identity into parts, or curiosity, we lose sight of the big picture and the real value that these transformative practices are attempting to create. So I think keeping them high level, allows also for educators to be seeing themselves reflected in those as well. So we're trying to keep them as broad as possible. And then moving away from this one size fits all, that, you know, we want to allow for some adaptations in local contexts and for changes to be made locally and move away from any kind of sort of set rigidity, and giving districts agency in supporting them for both adults and students. And that this would inherently create the need for collaboration, which is where transformation tends to live when we work with others. And that sense of agency and making choices and having voice in those decision-making pieces are a critical part of that. So that's the why. And then the how, it would look like each focal construct, well, the students panel would actually take your recommendations and help shape them into focal constructs that would support schools and districts. Because right now they're just words, and so they'd have to be fleshed out what it would look like. And then ODE would help with the guidance and tools based on the recommendations. So ODE would have a part in terms of supporting with toolkit or guidance, what those would actually look like in implementation, and in partnership with ESDs and other entities. And so what does it mean for our work right now? What is being proposed is that the transformative SEL constructs become the standards, practices, principles, whatever we want to call them, and that they are intentionally left broad. And we would, in this case, remove the CASEL competencies and just focus on the transformative SEL, and noting that there's a balance. It doesn't mean we're not doing CASEL or that that's not happening. It just means that we're trying to balance what does the state do and what do other, you know, local actions, what does that look like outside of the state level work. And so that would include the removal of also developmental or grade level bans. So those are all just things we are curious about what you all think. And, you know, we'll start off with some questions and then we can figure out what's coming up.
Yeah, so love to hear any questions or points of clarification. What's on the table right now is in the student standards. Maybe it's helpful if I screen share it. Do you want to stop sharing for a second? Thank you. Let me pull it up here. Okay, so what you've seen in the report under student standards fundamentals, and I can make this a little bigger, is what's in the current draft of the report is this recommendation that for both SEL and CASEL, that SEL layers on top of CASEL. We hadn't gotten into more discussion about what that means to layer on top of, but both are currently present as recommendations in the report. And then in addition, the advisory group in this draft recommended we can statements, making sure that everyone can show up differently along the progression. And then, as Vanessa was saying, standards written in broad bands, not specific to grade level. And so the proposal right now would be to take out CASEL as a primary recommendation, to leave it just at the transformative SEL constructs, and to also take out the written in broad bands piece, because there would be no developmental piece to the standards. It would be naming broadly standards, principles, K through 12.
Can I ask 2 clarifying questions?
Yeah.
So, or I guess one of them is just more of a confusion, because my understanding, I just went back and looked at my notes, that transformative SEL is CASEL. Those competencies come out of CASEL. And so to like separate, saying we're not going to do CASEL, but we are doing SEL, I'm just confused. Is there?
Yeah, you're right, Angela. So it would be the competencies that wouldn't be like the focus or the primary piece. It would be the transformative you
So
know,
we
the
would-
promise of those.
So we would still need to give Castle credit because they.
Yes.
Okay, I
Totally.
just want to
Yeah.
clarify, because that, unless they came from somewhere else.
No, they came from Castle, yeah.
So the second piece, and I think this is a clarifying question too, is I understand very little about Oregon governments and how school districts have to work, but my understanding is there's a local control, right? So what, Vanessa, were you talking about not digging deep, like not having specific competencies or sub-competencies at the state level, because the idea would be for districts to do that on their own?
Yes, yeah, that's right.
Vanessa, one more point of clarification that I didn't say. Part of the recommendation is to also take out that standards are written in both I can, we can statements.
Yeah, and that could or could not happen. You all get to decide on all of these pieces, but that would be, right, a recommendation that we wouldn't necessarily frame them that way, although like the mathematical ones are. And so there is there's the user-friendly piece of that could happen. So I didn't intentionally put it there because I think it's still a possibility.
I have a question too. So in that feedback, and the reason why to take out the more like explicit ones is so that regionally people can make their own decisions, and that people were just kind of like tired of doing all of the like the intricacies of it? Or did it come from like any of that feedback given by those work groups?
So it came from all of it. So conversations internally here and on this team that we've named, conversations in the engagement sessions. There's a worry about the developmentally appropriate piece. Who is deciding that? How are they deciding that? And how does it create and honor different ways of being? And so that was what the engagement sessions really named and surfaced, that there's a real worry for that. On top of this initiative overload, and how do we make, if we have these discrete skills by grade level or in grade level bands, what's the likelihood of those being integrated if they're small, right? We lose sight of the power of what those values really are trying to communicate and trying to transform.
I guess my concern then would be that we would then ask school districts to make decisions about developmentally appropriate when the feedback is that maybe or maybe I have a question. Was the feedback that we shouldn't, or that developmentally appropriate and like who gets to decide that? I guess I would worry in school districts that maybe are white dominant systems, that like we are continuing then to ask them to make developmentally appropriate considerations for those minute, I don't know if I'm making sense, like the breakdown of those. And then
So they would not be developmentally appropriate is what you all are considering. So they wouldn't even, no district would do that work either. They
okay,
would
I guess
be
that was
broad, like the mathematical practices. They would be identity, curiosity, right? All those 5 transformative ones, but they would be intentionally broad to allow for teams, school teams, districts to consider, how does this make the most sense with the curriculum that we already have in place? And so allow for those local decisions and provide agency to teachers in designing how it fits best for their student populations.
Yeah.
So no one is actually creating them to be developmentally appropriate.
I think my concern with that is just my experience with the health curriculum. And when the health standards weren't as defined, when a lot of agency was given to teachers, we had some teachers that did an amazing job of that. And other health teachers, I would go into their classes and really nothing was being taught in the name of still teaching to the standards. That's my concern.
Yeah, so I know Andrea's had a hand up for a while, so want to get there, but wanted to just ground first in what we're trying to do here around naming standards. Pooja, did you want to jump in?
Why don't you start and I'll add if there's anything else.
Yeah, so just the what we're tasked with in this group is setting what the statewide standard fundamentals will be. And so obviously ODE could name guidance or toolkits or whatnot to get into more detail later, but the objective of this group at this point is like, what is going to be fundamental to what we're saying around SEL for students? And I think what I've heard from Vanessa and others is there was a lot of concern about over focus on student behaviors and lack of focus on systems and structures. And so one of the goals that I'm hearing in naming broad focal constructs is that it's about all of us and it's not putting it into a deficit mindset around what students can or should be able to do. Do you want to add to that, Pooja, before we get to Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to, we said this at the last meeting, so I'm going to reiterate that the purpose, they're just stepping out of the weeds for a moment and looking at the big picture of what the legislation asked for this particular group is to come up with recommendations for a framework and recommendations for a standard that we have then interpreted as not the standards themselves of what children need to know and do, but what are the like high level architecture, because you can't possibly come up in the amount of time that you had, even if you wanted to come up with all of the I can, we can statements. That's just not logistically possible and doesn't do the service that you all really have expressed really wanting to do. And so what this group is charged with is to come up with that high level architecture, the fundamentals that is going to guide the next part of the process after the State Board of Education reviews kind of your recommendations. There'll be another work group. Many of you might be on it to take this group's work a step further. But the talking about the I can, we can statements that came out of the standards work group of this process, that was developed before we really kind of clarified with you all what the fundamentals really means. In other words, that was a step ahead of the game is what I'm offering. And it's absolutely relevant. You can make recommendations of like, the next group should use I can, we can formats to translate what your recommendations are a step further in a way that can mitigate some of those issues that Jim and some of you are naming around. If we give too much autonomy to local districts, they might not do it. That's absolutely a valid point. And we really want to set you all up for success in doing something that's actually tangible and doable within the time you have. And that is in alignment with the charge of the legislation, which is the high level architecture. And so that's why Vanessa is proposing that we kind of let go of the details of every single developmentally appropriate milestone and save that part for the next part and really focus on that high level direction that you want to make sure that the next group has to make sure that this is aligned with the guiding principles.
So let's go to Andrea, and then I'm going to ask, someone asked in the chat about, can we go through each of them individually? And we can go through the recommendations individually. So let's go to Andrea, and then we'll go there.
I appreciate the additional explanation there, Pooja. That's helpful. So I guess that my comments are twofold, like, because it seems like we're talking about two things. Like, on one hand, I have some concerns about completely dropping the original 5 CASEL competencies. I'm not sure I can completely put my finger on why. I just feel like there's something lost if we just use the TESOL. So like I'm looking on page 36 in the yellow highlight where there's, you know, maybe some options about viewing them as on-ramps, as competencies, or some sort of integration or a grading. Part of that concern comes from, I also want, and again, I'm two things. I tested positive for COVID this morning, so I'm not feeling my best, and it's hot. And I just want to, I want these to be accessible across the state. Like, I have a real interest in this being a successful work. And I think some people, some folks will have a difficult time just seeing the TESOL. how do we show the on-ramp? How do we show the progression? How do we show the evolution of even what Castle has gone through in the 5 competencies into the transformative SEL? So I feel like I would need more discussion before I felt confident giving my sort of consensus, my high level consensus, to completely drop the Castle. On the developmental framework, or the developmentally appropriate, I definitely hear what's being said, right? Want to stay out of the weeds. How do we temper that with the concern from the advisory group that we wouldn't want any future standards work to go too far the other direction, right? How do we name that it's a value that the standards, when they're written by the standards work group, are broader as opposed to very sort of chopped up by kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, fourth grade. So what's the right balance? If we're making the recommendations to the state board, who then will be charging the standards work group, how do we also say the flip side is maybe don't do developmentally appropriate, but also please don't do overly extensive grade level standards.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah, I think if you want to jump in, Vanessa, you're welcome to. But I think the recommendation on the table and why Vanessa shared the mathematical principles is that those never get to the point of grade level or grade level bands, even that they are K-12 appropriate mathematical principles, what it means to me, a mathematical thinker, mathematical learner. And I think that's the proposal on the table. Right, Vanessa?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. Okay, so I think what we should do is take the pieces one by one and just get a check on where people are at. So I think the first proposal is around just having T-cell in the report as the primary focus of the standards. So those would be named as we want the next iteration. We want the standards work group to dig into what these mean for schools and districts, but we would leave out the CASEL competencies. So that's the proposal on the table. Take out CASEL competencies, just have the T-cell constructs as the recommendation of this work group for the next work group to dig into what that means. So I would like to hear from not ODE staff or any consultants, but only the members of the work group, of the advisory group. So if you're a member of the advisory group, I would like you to put a 0 through 5 in the chat to that point. So a 5 would be, I love just using T-cell, full supported, I'll go talk about it to everybody. Down to a 0 would be like, not at all okay with me. And I can share. Okay. So far from consensus there. So I think what we will do is when we come back to the student standards in small groups, we will talk more about the relationship between T-cell and CASEL and what others in the group might be leaning for. So then the second piece is around taking out the developmentally appropriate or the concept of grade band. So right now what it says in the report is the standard should be written in broad bands, K2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, 12, not by a specific grade level. So the proposal is to take those out, take out that statement completely. And the encouragement would be for them to not be written by any sort of grade level, to have high level K-12 standards. Okay. So again, if members of the advisory group would put in 0 through 5. 0 means block. 1 means don't support but won't block. 2 means minimal support. 3 means not in total agreement. 4 means solid support. And 5 means you love that idea. Did everybody vote on that one?
Yes, Amy.
Okay. So what I'm seeing there is close to consensus on that piece. I only saw one vote that was oh wait, no, I see 2 votes that are below a 3. 1, 2, and 1, 2 to 3. Okay. So closer on that piece, but we'll also come back there. Okay. Are we having fun? We're getting somewhere. We're hearing where there's consensus and disagreement. Great. Okay, so again, we'll pick up this conversation about the relationship between TESOL and CASEL in the CASEL competencies. There, as someone mentioned, both come from CASEL. The focal constructs and the competencies, we'll come back to that conversation in our small groups in a bit. But for now, we're going to move into a next proposal, which is around guiding principles and making some edits there.
Yeah, this would be helpful. Sharon, if you can bring us back to presentation mode and bring us to slide 17, that'd be great. So this is feedback that was given throughout the engagement sessions that we thought made sense and seemed to be in line with your all's values and conversations, but wanted to see how it's landing for you right now. So what has been changed is guiding principle 1, which was around equity. It was really about access. And so that whole principle was really centered around accessing and who has access to what. And in the conversations, it was clear that equity is more than just about access and should really include the value of linguistic and cultural ways of being. And so we changed the guiding principle to say equity centered, and then broadened it a little bit to move beyond just access. Do you want me to walk through all of them first, Amy, or one by one? Okay.
I think walk through them first. Yeah.
Okay. And if you're following along in the report, this is all on page 33, actually, because things are always changing in this document. So that's where you can find the additional changes that were made there. And then for guiding principle 3, there was a real need and want to, when we talk about inclusive practices, right, transforming systems through inclusive practices, that really needs to also include the discipline system and the discipline practices. So if we're talking about inclusion, we really need to talk about a sense of belonging and that all kids belong, and we're going to do everything we can to keep students connected to our school environments. So there was a lot of connections with restorative practices that folks on the student success plans are working on and advocating for. And it seemed to make sense to include that as part of this idea of inclusive practices. So what I've done is added the piece around restorative practices and making sure that our discipline is a match for these, right, transformative practices we want to move towards. So that was added. And then the last one was guiding principle number 4. So We had trauma-informed and developmentally appropriate. So there was, issues, questions around the developmentally appropriate piece. And also that can we be more strength-based? And if we're going to be strength-based in our language, like we all said was one of our guiding principles, then instead of trauma-informed, can we say we're healing-informed or healing-centered? And so really thinking about the arc and the vision that we are hoping our schools and our classrooms to be, that's what we want to center. So that's a language shift from trauma-informed to healing-informed. And those were the ones that were made. Any questions?
Yep, questions, clarifications.
I have 2 questions. So do you want to keep the language of developmentally appropriate, even though we're going to ask them not to have that developmentally appropriate part later?
So I think that's what we're figuring it out right now.
Okay.
So,
Gotcha.
right, we kind of put a pin on that for now. It sounds like there is enough potential movement to revisit that. And when we go into breakout rooms later, we'll do that.
And then the other part is, if we're talking about healing informed, like recognizing that all forms of oppression cause trauma, do we want to center that first, or do we want to talk about like our goal is to have healing, and then recognizing that if we don't do these things, that might be traumatic? I just feel like that language in there still focuses on trauma rather than the healing part. Are we getting nitty gritty? I guess I don't know how like big and little picture we're getting.
I don't really know either, but that's a good observation and something we'd want to really make sure is aligned. And we're not losing either concept, but I think what we want to do is frame our guiding principles in a affirming, possibility space. And so that's where that, asset strength-based approach using that language came up, and we can still name what we name in that section. But you all decide. You all get to say. Yeah, Todd, I see your hand up.
I don't dislike healing informed. It's just kind of new to me, so I had to kind of reprocess this because my training is in the brain science and the body response, and Bruce Perry's stuff. So, is there literature out there? If we say healing informed, people are going to be able to find stuff on that. We've shifted, like we use resilience and building resilient communities or building resilient people, and as a way to go after, because we all are going to experience hardships and trauma in different degrees, kind of like what Annie just said. And so giving those tools to people so they can be, because to be resilient means to adapt positively to the adversities around you, not just bouncing back or standing firm, but you actually adapt positively. And I just wonder about the literature base for if we look up healing informed, because I just haven't done that. So it's my bad. I haven't figured that part out.
I think Todd raises a really good point, which I'm just curious about others of like, to what extent is it helpful for the advisory group to use terminology that is known across those who have the, who will be receiving this report? This is just a wondering on that piece. Because we don't want people to have to go out and read literature after reading your recommendations, right?
So there's been kind of a movement in talking about, and there's a couple of leaders, Sean Jenright, and just posted one of his articles in the chat, and Dina Simmons out of Harvard, or he's at Yale, she left it and went and started an organization called Liberate Ed that really talks about equity-based SEL and trauma-informed education. So it's not so much, so Todd, it's definitely not questioning Dr. Bruce Perry's work or calling any of that into question. It's saying, what's the added component of, do we do a disservice to trauma-informed education by focusing too much on the what's wrong with you, what happened to you, and not enough on then the follow-up question, what's also right with you. So when I think about healing-centered engagement and I think about SEL in particular, sorry, I'm just scrolling. The competencies of identity, agency, belonging, collaborative problem solving, and curiosity really tie directly into what those new leaders on healing-centered engagement or community-centered engagement are talking about. Interestingly, because we've been incorporating some of this into the OEA, trauma-informed education work, Flint, Michigan, the community-centered healing in Flint, Michigan around the water crisis has been held up as a real hallmark of how this looks like and works in practice. So that's a community that went through a big trauma around the water contamination crisis. How did they approach that from a healing standpoint, as opposed to purely a trauma, quote unquote, standpoint? So they're complementary and not contradictory.
Thanks, Andrea. I also want to expand a little bit for some context from where that came from. It also came from just this need that we're all need healing spaces post-pandemic. We've all come back with loss, and that we're all in that space, and we all deserve the opportunity to be able to heal and be in community spaces that cultivate that. And so that it was also a response to that. So it was kind of a more encompassing term. The few people that did talk about it were out of, I'm going to blank the name, so I shouldn't say it, but I believe it was Lane County, where they had done some professional development, and that group had come back and said, yeah, this, you know, this terminology is something that we can move towards.
I saw Melinda, yeah, and then I want to move us forward.
Yeah, so I think I have mixed emotions about healing informed as well, only because when we're looking at equity, what I like about trauma informed, it's up to us to be informed on how we're dealing and working with families and people. When we're looking at healing informed, that's going to look so different to every community. And even when we talk about, staff that is more comfortable with healing, I think that is very specific to a more educated group versus if we're working with community members. And I really agree, is this language going to cross over to different communities when we've been using trauma informed? I just don't have enough information as well on, is that used a lot? Is it not used a lot? You know what? I don't know. So are we starting a new trend and going to have to re-educate everyone, or are we going with something that already has a foundation and we're owning that we have to be trauma informed when we're serving people?
Okay. What I'd like to do is take these piece by piece and get clear on what the proposal is and take a consensus vote. And we're gonna do it in a doc this time. It's easier to track than in the chat. So, and for some of these, I should say too, that as we keep going in this process, there may be things that we don't ever get consensus on. And if that is the case, we can raise the questions or the conversations that we had in this group in the final report. But for these guiding principles, I think, again, we're trying to set out what are the key considerations that we want people to use as they're implementing SEL and moving forward in the work group. And so obviously the words are important, and we can say more about what we're intending by them in the hope that they get used in the way we want them to get used. So the first one we want to take a vote on is changing guiding principle 1 to equity centered. Changing guiding principle 1 to equity centered as the main piece. Let me put this in the chat. Okay, that should take you right to a chart where you can put your name and your vote. Let me know if you have any trouble with that. Okay, great. We'll make that change to equity centered. Let me do this one. So the second one is to not change on guiding principle 3. We're not changing what the headline is, but we are including something about restorative practices in the description, so that we're saying SEL also is important in discipline. So if you're already in there, you can just scroll down to the next chart where it says include RJ practices in guiding principle 3. Yes, Annie, I saw that note. Okay, great. And then the last one, I heard a lot of pieces, and I think where people were landing is desire to keep it as trauma informed, but to, in the description, really focus on that this is not about just sort of an over focus on deficits or an over focus on what's not working for students, that we want a more asset-based frame around guiding principle 4. So I think that's the proposal on the table. Keep it trauma informed, but add a little more nuance into it, including talking about healing in the description. Sorry, your votes are still in this one.
Can I go back and change my vote to 0 on the last one? I have a lot of problems with the way the behaviorist is used in number 3. So I would actively work against it because of that language.
And yes, so you're talking about including restorative justice.
Yes, it's the green type below that talks about moving from a behaviorist point of view to a relational point of view. It's the wording that's incredibly inaccurate. I've never seen I've never seen discipline hearings be behaviorist. They're authoritarian or authoritative, but they are not behaviorist at all. As a behaviorist, it does nothing to teach behavior. Traditional discipline does nothing to teach behavior. It doesn't shape behavior. The word behaviorist in that context is worse than misleading.
Thanks, Jim. So to be clear, you have deep concerns about the language in there. Do you have concerns about talking about restorative justice practices in principle 3?
Not at all. It's the language around behaviorist.
Okay, so are you comfortable with me leaving your vote as a 4 on including restorative justices, but noting deep concerns about other language in the principle?
Yep.
Okay.
Well, if that were actually, no, I want to keep it at a 0.
Okay.
Because I want to make sure that it's taken care of.
So I'm thinking about this, Jim, and I'm thinking, about some of our conversation about, I think a lot of that for me, as I reflect backwards, right, the conversation around behaviorists came out of a lot of our discomfort around like PBIS systems, right, that sort of focus on that. And I really hear your point that discipline proceedings are rarely behaviorist, they're authoritarian and punitive. And so I'm wondering if that's the wrong sort of combining two ideas into one sentence there, right? There's discipline procedures, and then there's like behaviorist frameworks that have been used. And so maybe it's like teasing that apart so that the sentences say what we mean.
That would be it exactly. Yeah.
Okay. We've noted that. So a point to come back to next time. All right, the last vote that we're doing on the guiding principles is around the principle for keeping it trauma informed, but to have more description or focus on healing in the conversation about it. And if you're more on the side of like, no, we shouldn't say trauma, then you would not give this a 3 or above. If you want it changed to healing, you would give it a 0, 1, or 2. You see a lot of torn faces. No, it's hard to be pushed to give a number, but it's helpful in getting us closer to consensus.
I just need a little bit more explanation about the developmentally appropriate. We just spent quite a bit of time talking about taking out developmentally appropriate, and now we're revisiting it. So I'm confused.
Yeah, okay, let's separate that one out. So right now we're just talking about leaving it trauma informed. So this vote, trauma informed, but more focus on healing in the context. Let's do a separate one on keeping developmentally appropriate in the top line. Knowing that we aren't, we haven't gotten to a decision on keeping it in the standards either. So maybe that's just more conversation is necessary there. But for now, let's take out the votes. Okay, so we've put in numbers around trauma informed, but more focus on healing in the context. And now we're talking about keeping developmentally appropriate in the guiding principle. If you support keeping developmentally appropriate in the guiding principle, you would give that a 3, 4, or 5. If you don't support keeping developmentally appropriate in the guiding principle, you would give it a 0, 1, or 2. Okay. If you haven't voted on any of those, if you would give your best guess decision. Okay. Great. All right, there maybe more to dig into. Yep. See Andrea's note, it feels different using it here. And Todd would like more discussion. Okay, so clearly we have some pieces to come back to in the guiding principles. For now, we want to give you a 5-minute break before we keep going. We know this is like we're pushing and it's hard and there's a lot we want to get right and holding that we're like trying to get it very right with all your brains in the room and move towards consensus, which is challenging. So let's take a 5-minute break, get yourself some water, do what you need to do, and we'll come back at 58. 5:58. Oh, thanks, Beth, or Sharon. Thank you, Sharon. Okay. Welcome back. Thanks, Melissa. All right. I know there's a lot of, well, we're holding a lot around those conversations. Before we go to these small groups, which we're going to get into next, I just wanted to give a minute if there's anything people want to say, because I think people are wanting to hear from each other a little bit more on any of these conversations. I saw some pieces in the chat about developmentally appropriate, question about wanting to hear from others. So anything that you haven't shared with the group around developmentally appropriate or the other pieces, trauma informed, that you want to share with the group before we move on for now, knowing we'll come back to these in the next meeting. Okay. All right, more discussion to be had. So as we're getting into the next sets of pieces of the framework, the student standards, which we did talk a little bit about already, but we're going to come back to it, the system standards, and the implementation considerations across both of those. We want to get into small groups to go deeper on some of the conversations, questions to be had here. So we're going to have you choose which small group you want to be part of. So group one is going to focus around the student standards. So we'll talk more in that group about the relationship between SEL, between the focal constructs, and the competencies, and how we want to talk about those in the report. And then we'll talk about other implementation considerations we should add in related to student standards. And the hope would be that we can have some discussion in that small group, and then we'll bring it back to the big group as a recommendation if we can get to that point. Otherwise, we'll share with the big group what our conversation was to that point and try to take some more consensus votes. So that's group one on the student standards. Group two is on the system standards. So what needs to be in place in the system to support SEL? And there were 3 implementation considerations to focus on. One is an implementation consideration around the Quality Education Commission and what we could name there, what opportunity is there to name support for this SEL work. Oh, did we lose? We might have lost Sharon. Did we lose Sharon? Oh, okay. I can share here.
Amy, I can share mine if you want.
Okay, that'd be great. Thanks, Beth. The second question is around ratios. Do we want to get in naming ratios, mental health professionals, and the implementation considerations? And then the last one, which came up in report feedback, was around MTSS and thinking about what's essential about that you want to name as an implementation consideration, and reminding ourselves that we're really trying to stay high level at this point to provide a framework for the next group to take, and recommendations for the state board at this point to support the implementation of SEL. So we'd like you to choose. I know we are losing people, so we are a small group, and we'll see how this split goes, because maybe we end up having one conversation. But if you would now choose a group, you should have an invitation to group to join. You can join room 1 if you want to focus on student standards, and room 2 if you want to focus on system standards and implementation considerations there. And I'm gonna, okay, well, let's see. Okay, well, we had at least one person in room 2. Do you want to jump in there, Pooja?
Hi, sorry. My internet kicked me out and I don't
here.
know what is happening.
Okay, we are right now choosing a breakout room to join. So breakout room 1 is around, if you want to focus on the conversation around student standards and the relationship between TESOL and CASEL. It should be at the bottom of your screen, Jim, where it says breakout room. Is there a little red thing there? Yep. And room 2 is talking about system standards and implementation opportunities there. So if you want to talk about opportunities for implementation, systems opportunities, you'd go with room 2. If you want to talk about student standards, you'd go to room 1.
Annie, which one do you want to go to? I'll put
Right.
you in.
One,
One?
thank you.
Got it. Oh. You're not in here. Um,
I sent her, she's on her iPhone.
okay, she's on her iPhone, I see. Okay. Are you going into one?
No, but do you want me to pause the recording?
I think probably, yeah, until they come back.
Yeah.
I think you can stop right now.
What's that, Amy?
I'm gonna stop the screen share.
Oh, yep.
So I know that was brief and got some good information to come back to next time. Would love to invite people in each group to just share what was landing for them. I imagine there weren't decisions, but maybe there were that we can come back to, and then know what we need to dig into more next time. So I think we had a bigger group in group 1, so I wonder if group 2 wants to start.
Melinda, do you want to share a little bit what we talked about? You want me to start?
Yes, why don't you start? Because I'm having a hard time talking.
Yeah, of course. Of course. So we talked about system fundamentals and got as far as we can write all of the great language as we want, and just this common thread throughout all of our conversations, what does it mean for implementation? How the concerns about these types of standards about the system falling to the bottom of budget priorities for districts. And so where is the accountability that school districts should be funded to implement this stuff, and that we should as a community make sure that everybody's held accountable for their piece of the system in order to make sure that we're creating the conditions for kids to thrive. So we didn't get to part of the funding that is in the implementation consideration report around what role the Quality Education Commission plays in that, but I'll just say briefly, there is a placeholder recommendation around that we can come to probably at next month's meeting. Essentially, every year, every biennium, when educators, school administrators, others go to the state legislature and the governor's office to request funding for schools, the Quality Education Commission, which is an advisory group, much like the State Board of Education and approved by the Senate, they actually have something called the Quality Education Model. It's like this very mathy thing with a lot of factors that build into staffing needs for schools. And this essentially generates this magic number that says this is what it means to fully fund schools. And this number that is developed by the Quality Education Commission in the Quality Education Model is not updated very often. And they're going to update it within the next 2 years. And this is a commission that's out of the Oregon Department of Education. And so one of the opportunities is to consider whether there is a recommendation in your report that whatever that group is, that they consider how to implement SEL standards through funding. Like, what are the funding needs that needs to happen so schools can implement this well with fidelity according to your recommendations, that somebody figures that out and that it's built into the next iteration of the base funding for schools as a way to embolden all of us who want to make sure that we are all doing our part to make sure that these standards aren't just a virtual book on a virtual shelf, but that they're actually money out the door to make sure that schools implement this in the way that you all imagine. So we can talk a little bit more about that, but that's somewhat of what the group talked about.
Thanks, Patricia and Melinda. We had a quick discussion about the relationship between TESOL and CASEL and how people are landing around that. Does anyone from the group want to really synthesize in 1 to 2 minutes what was coming out of the conversation? And Todd, you're looking like you almost want to hit. There we go.
I will, just because nobody else is. Angela, you should say these things. You said it much better. I think essentially the relationship that my feeling is that without the castle concepts there, it's sort of like the foundation of the house isn't present. And so we'd be building something without the foundation. So I think, feel like you can have those castle standards in there without being explicit to each developmental grade level along the way, but have the big concepts there. And the other big takeaway for me is just reminding ourselves that these are skills that we're talking about. And if we're not really going to be explicit, then these things, again, other groups have taken SEL and redefined it as something else, and that is not okay. And we should be clear. And I think without clarity, we're maybe doing a disservice to our school districts about what that next step is. Angela had mentioned how superintendents are coming along with this, and there is support for this, but I think if we're not clear about what that is, it's going to get lost. How'd I do?
Thank you for being willing to jump in. Other piece I heard too was talking about the relationship between individual and community and how we describe the relationship between TESOL and CASEL too. Can't tell if I am frozen or frozen. I'm going to keep talking. So, okay, that's a piece we'll come back to, but definitely a lot of interest in keeping the competencies and building in some sort of braided relationship. So a piece we need to have further discussion on. So with our last 8 minutes together, in the past, well, just appreciation to you all. I know we were a smaller group tonight and it meant you all had to do a lot of work and talking and thinking together. And so appreciate you coming on this warm Monday in most places to have this discussion and really dig into the meat of these recommendations together. So that's how we're going to get there over the next few months. So in the past couple meetings, we had done a Google Doc to do back, which was really helpful. You could all see each other's comments and see where other people were. But for tonight, we wanted to offer an anonymous survey to get a sense of how people are feeling about the report and where we're headed. So what we'd like to do is take 5 minutes now to have you fill out the survey. It is anonymous, and really wanting to get a sense of how the report is feeling for you, what's missing, what's needed, so that we're pretty clear as we're coming into July around at least where you all in this room are, and then hopefully we can get some others and get a sense of where some others are too. So if you would take 5 minutes, and if you're done early, you could just put done in the chat so I know to fill out the survey. That would be great. Let's take one more minute and recognizing if you want to finish, have more to say, you can say more and submit later. I'll take one more minute for now. All right. Nessa, do you want to move us into where we're headed?
Yeah, totally. Thanks, everybody, for taking the time, for your energy, your thoughtfulness, your heart, all that you brought today. Really appreciate you all. And we are going to just close out with what it looks like for us. We have 3 meetings left. Well, really 2 now after today. So we have quite a bit of work to do, but we're also coming into what the recommendations are. So that feels really awesome. So in July, we'll spend most of the time between now and our July meeting coming up with a draft 4. So a lot of what you all discussed today will be kind of integrated into this new draft that you will see before our July meeting. And then in August, when we meet again for our last time, that's really our final opportunity to look at a final revision and take a formal vote on any piece around the recommendations, and then think about prepping for the state board meeting. So we are hoping that one of you is interested in joining us in that work, as it is your recommendations. So would love to be able to support you and be with you in spirit in that space. And then September, all of this gets submitted to the State Board of Education. And then the 22nd is the day that we have some time before them to talk through where we've landed. Just want to note too, as we move through these final drafts, if you have any recommendations or if it isn't working for you to do the spreadsheet, please just email me. I'm keeping track of things myself. So if that feels clunky or not right, just know that you can access me in all kinds of ways so that it is reflective of what your hopes are for this report. And with that, I'll turn it over to Beth to say goodnight.
Thanks, Vanessa. So we're coming to the close of our meeting, and we'd just like you to share 2 words that are capturing how you're feeling as you're leaving. And you can either share those out or feel free to add them in the chat. I'm seeing things pop in there. Almost there. Yes. Hopeful, grateful, grounded, grateful again. Lots of gratefulness. Finish line is quickly approaching. Yes. Trepidatious and, oh gosh, for Schwarzwitz. I'm sure I didn't say that right.
Verschwitzt.
Verschwitz.
Verschwitzt.
Verschwitz. Hopeful and grateful. Well, we just want to say thank you for leaning in tonight. We know there's been some challenging conversations and just really holding that number 3 community agreement with challenging our assumptions and trying to move us to where we want to be from where we've been. So just greatly appreciate all of you and want to wish you a great month of July. We'll see you on the 25th for our next meeting in July. And then also look for an invite for us shortly. And we'll be sending out the next 2 meeting dates. Make sure they're on your calendars. And please, please, please reach out any questions that you have, and any other, like Vanessa said, if you want to provide feedback in a different way, we'd love to hear it. So thank you.
Thank you all. Night.
Good night. Be well. Whew.